So next is Suzanne Novak. She's an attorney at the Earthjustice Northeast office in New York. She's a litigator and a policy advocate in the organization's Healthy Communities program, where she focuses on safe drinking water with current emphasis on PFAS.
So thank you for having me, and as Anne alluded to earlier, I'm one of the people that's messing up the schedule here, that you now have a lawyer in the afternoon, so I'll try to be a little more interesting than lawyers are known to be. And I also want to thank you for all the comments about Deborah Goldberg. I will pass that on when I go back to the office. I've known Deborah, I've worked with her on and off for decades, and so it's pretty sad that she's retiring, but I'm glad you all appreciate all the work that she has done throughout the state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is like PFAS Part 2. After Judith's presentation earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about PFAS. I'm going to talk about it on military bases, and I'm going to talk about litigation, and because this is for activists, a little talk about activism in the realm. So I know when Judith asked, maybe about half of you said that you were very familiar with PFAS, so I'm just going to give some basic facts for those of you that aren't as familiar. PFAS is a group of approximately 5,000 man-made chemicals used in many everyday consumer products. They are special and known as forever chemicals because they are persistent, very resistant to degradation, and bioaccumulative in our bodies. So we get a little bit in our bodies, and they just accumulate over time. 99% of people in America now have some trace of PFAS in their bodies. And they are associated with serious medical effects like cancer, impaired liver function, impaired fertility and fetal development, and weakened immune system. Industry spent decades covering up these associations. And testing has only been done on a handful of PFAS. In fact, there are only ways to test for the presence of a handful of PFAS, which is pretty alarming. And so we can't detect them, and obviously you can't test and find out what they're associated with if you can't even test for their presence. The main pathway is drinking water, and sometimes air to drinking water. They're used in firefighting foam, so there's a high contamination near military bases and commercial airports. And there's also a high contamination near PFAS manufacturing plants and plants making consumer products that use PFAS. So why are we so worried about PFAS? Well, I told you about the serious medical effects that they're associated with. But some of the additional reasons why we're so worried is that they are highly unregulated. There is no federal MCL for drinking water. There's just a health advisory for only 2 of the legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFAS, at 70 parts per trillion. However, a report came out last year from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, known as ATSDR. I don't know if you heard about it. The federal government was trying to suppress this report because they said it would be, quote, a public relations nightmare. And that report came out. It was an 850-page report that, if you took all the numbers in there, said that the real limits for the PFAS that they tested should be 7 to 10 times lower than the health advisory level that EPA had put out. And so that's alarming because you don't even have an enforceable regulation, and the advisory regulation seems way too high. Then increasingly, as more scientific information has been coming out, the conclusion is that the safe levels are even lower than that. NRDC recently argued that MCL for those legacy PFAS should be as low as 2 parts per trillion. And then to show you how out of whack it is that these are unregulated, there are no federal regulations for them, so they're not on the hazardous substance lists for cleanup for Superfund sites. And it just came out last week that DOD is putting pressure on EPA that if they're going to set those standards, to set it at 400 parts per trillion. So the science is saying that the level should be as low as 2 parts per trillion, and DOD is saying if you're going to get set levels, we think it should be at 400 parts per trillion. Another major problem is because of their lack of regulation, they're not on what's known as the toxic release inventory. There are a lot of chemicals that if a plant, somewhere where chemicals are used, stored, they're released, there's some sort of spill or their regular waste goes in, they have to make notifications, notify government, and then the government might need to notify the public. No PFAS are on the toxics release inventory, which is why when Judith was telling the story about Hoosick Falls, they're released, and if people don't think of it, nobody tells anyone, and then the public doesn't know, and they're still drinking their water. Another problem with PFAS is they're very difficult to treat because they have these strong bonds. I can't remember if I mentioned it. What signifies PFAS is that they have carbon and fluorine molecules, and that's the strongest bond in chemistry. I'm not a chemist, I hope there's no one here to correct me, but that's why they don't biodegrade. And so they're also very hard to treat, and they're also very hard, we don't fully know how to dispose of them safely either. So this is quite a conundrum for these chemicals. And since TSCA, the Toxic Substance Release Act, when the new one went into effect in 2016, it was supposed to make chemicals all that more regulated. But studies have shown that there are a lot of loopholes and a lot of chemicals are being approved without going through the approval process that they're supposed to. And then I'll get to other things. I'll stop this more depressing part of it is that the industry argues, well, I guess I'm not stopping, I'll just move on to a more specific area, the military bases. Industry argues that their new PFAS are safer. There are fewer molecules than the older ones. But there is no evidence to show that they are safer. And given that the older ones were not safe, and industry told us for decades that they were, industry also has very little credibility in this realm. And in fact, some recent studies that have been coming out have been showing that some of the shorter chain replacement chemicals are associated with similar serious medical effects, and that some of them are even harder to capture in water and to treat water. So they come with different dangers as well, and they're also more mobile because they are shorter chain. So that's some general PFAS information. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the military, since the military uses a lot of this firefighting foam for exercises. And there have been reports documenting what's been going on in military bases, and I'll tell you a few of the lowlights. There are 1,500 drinking water systems across the U.S. Servicing 110 million people that are estimated to be contaminated with PFAS of at least 2.5 parts per trillion. That wasn't particular to military, but that's how widespread this problem is, and it's in targeted communities, but a lot of communities. So DOD data has indicated shockingly high PFAS concentrations in groundwater at military installations. The Union of Concerned Scientists mapped PFAS contamination of groundwater and drinking water at 131 active and formerly active military bases across 37 states. And they found of those 131 bases, 130 exceeded the ATSDR level that I mentioned earlier of 11 parts per trillion. More than half of the sites with drinking water contamination had PFAS concentrations at least 10 times higher than the ATSDR level, and that more than 90% of the sites had PFAS concentration that were more than 10 times higher than the ATSDR levels. So these are really alarming statistics. There's no requirement that the government notify or test military personnel or former personnel or their families about the exposures or the risks. DOD has spent some money on the problem, but it's mainly been about testing and providing water supplies, and not really cleaning up the sites. And they have prioritized sites with other types of contamination because those contaminants are regulated, and so they have more requirements to focus on those sites. And because PFAS is not on the Superfund hazardous substance list, DOD is starting to make arguments now that they do not need to abide by the state regulation amounts, because some states are taking action because of the lack of federal action, but the federal government is now claiming what's known as sovereign immunity, which means I have not agreed that you can regulate me, the federal government, and because I've not agreed and there's no federal regulation, you cannot. And I also wanted to highlight that PFAS-free foam is used around the world. At least 77 airports, 47 corporations, Norwegian and Danish air forces, and many worldwide fire brigades have switched to using PFAS-free foam. And the US military, all they've done is moved from using those long chain PFAS in their foam to using those shorter chain replacement chemicals. And so what has happened as a result? Well, a lot of states have started becoming really active in trying to regulate in this realm, and New York being one of them that's starting on it, New Jersey and Vermont. And there has been a lot of activism around PFAS, and there are many communities that are affected that have been forming and working together. There's also something called the National PFAS Contamination Coalition, where a lot of these smaller groups are part of this coalition, and I'd be happy to put anyone in touch with the organizers of that. Earth Justice and I particularly work in a coalition called Safer States, and we work in a coalition finding out what's going on in other states. We work with scientists, we work with lawyers, and we're very active in trying to make things happen, and the activists have been very successful at pushing different bills in their states. A personal note of how I got involved in the issue is there was a case in the Third Circuit, Gianni versus US Navy, where a family had sued the Navy because their water had been contaminated. The family lived near two bases that are now Superfund sites, and they sued the Navy. And the lawyer working on it was looking around for amicus help, and so amicus curiae is a friend of the court brief. And so I started connecting with some people, some individuals who either currently lived or used to live near those bases, and they started telling me these horrific stories of all these unusual medical effects that had happened to members of their family, getting very sick, dying young, that had happened to their dog. One of the people, her 3-year-old son had brain cancer, and 2 other people who had grown up on her street, their kids, also under the age of 5, had the same brain cancer, which was a cancer that is unusual and usually only seen in men over 60. And so I was so moved by this, and we submitted a brief to the court, and the plaintiffs won. It was about sovereign immunity, and also about a CERCLA provision where the Navy was just saying, you are not allowed to sue us. You can't bring us into court. Plaintiffs had lost in the lower court and then won in the Third Circuit. And then we joined forces. I moved from representing the amicus to helping to represent the plaintiff. The Navy asked the Third Circuit, please reconsider your decision. We're in the middle of all that briefing right now. And then if they lose again, I assume that they will seek a petition for certiorari, file a petition for certiorari with the U.S. Supreme Court about the issue. There's a lot to do on the state level. I don't know if you're aware, the Drinking Water Council held a hearing and voted to recommend to the Department of Health to propose a regulation for PFOA and PFAS at 10 parts per trillion, which we still don't think is low enough, but would be the lowest in the nation. And we're waiting for DOH to propose a regulation about those chemicals. And there's a lot of work to be done about that, either before they propose them or after they propose them, to submit comments and be active. This is a very political issue, so you could be active with the Department of Health, you could be active with Cuomo staff. What we were talking about before, when we were talking about sometimes that people don't listen to the activists, we went to this hearing and it was a little odd. It was open, and my colleagues and I all had testimony, and they had testimony around the state. And first, the Drinking Water Council voted on the levels they wanted at, and then they opened it up for comment from the public, which seemed like precisely the wrong order. So that's also something that activists should, be active about, which is, if you're going to hear us, actually set it up so you at least look like you're listening to us before you vote. Industry is starting to respond to all this activism that's going on in the states and trying to put out their spin, and their spin is usually these new replacement chemicals are better. And then before I talk a little bit about the lawsuits that are going on, I just wanted to tell you two themes that we really push a lot, and that a lot of the activists around the nation push, are that we need more information, so that these chemicals need to be on the toxics release inventory. We need to know where they're made, we need to know where they're released, and also that they need to be regulated as a class. Otherwise, we're just playing a game of whack-a-mole, and industry likes this. Okay, go ahead and regulate PFOA and PFAS. PFOA and PFAS are not even manufactured in the United States anymore at all. So we'll just keep using new ones as you regulate the old ones, and you'll never catch up. And that's why they need to be regulated as a class. So in addition to activism and bills being proposed and passed in the states, there are now many lawsuits, thankfully, about PFAS. There are various defendants. People are suing manufacturers, they're suing processors, and there are a handful of suits suing Department of Defense. One of them is the city of Newburgh, who I work closely with some activists there, but it's the city itself that's suing. And there are various plaintiffs. There are injured or exposed persons. There's a big suit in New York around Hoosick Falls about whether or not the residents can claim damage and get damages when they were exposed to the chemicals before they show symptoms. And the whole point is they want to get medical monitoring. It seems kind of backwards to make them show symptoms before they can get the relief of medical monitoring, because you wouldn't need monitoring if you already had your symptoms. Property owners sue. There's a bunch of class actions. People or entities that buy products or were misled are making claims that they weren't warned and they should have been warned. States and cities are starting to sue for damages and how they have to pay to clean this up. Public utilities, drinking water authorities are also plaintiffs in some of the suits, and some of them are public interest groups. And there are various claims. There are state law claims about personal injury, property damage, design defect, failure to warn that I mentioned. There are federal claims for violations of certain federal laws like RCRA and the Clean Water Act. And there's also a suit brought by the attorney who really started all of these suits, Rob Bilott, and he's claiming this is like really essentially doing national testing on people without their consent. It's like this big experiment that these companies are doing on us. And the various types of relief sought are damages for injuries to your person or your property, testing, blood testing, urine testing of people, medical monitoring, and then some are seeking injunctions where a court makes an order directing the stop of pollution, mandating cleanup, mandating a health study, mandating compliance with existing standards, prohibiting false advertising, taking away a permit, or limiting that permit to prohibit future releases. So that's all for now. I'll be around after for questions.